Hey everyone, welcome back to another gripping tale. Today, we're diving into a world of adventure, betrayal, and the darkest corners of the human heart. This is a story of a young man, a sailor with a promising future, whose world is shattered by tragedy and deceit. Prepare to be transported to the harsh realities of the 19th century, a time of exploration, commerce, and the sinister underbelly of the slave trade. Our protagonist will face unimaginable challenges as he navigates a treacherous path of revenge and redemption. With every twist and turn, you'll find yourself captivated by this epic saga of love, loss, and the indomitable human spirit. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride. Let's set sail. It's a business. Chapter 1. Prologue. We were having a wonderful evening in the first-class cabin when we felt a faint nudge. She whispered, "Almost." I immediately went back to my occupation. Then there was a knock on the cabin door, and a voice said, "All passengers report to the boat deck. This is an order from the captain." Since my wife and I were wearing nothing but frustrated, frowny faces, I partially opened the door and said, "It's the middle of the night. What the devil does the captain want to see us on the boat deck?" The steward stood in the passage holding a pair of those awful life belts made of sailcloth and cork. He said nonchalantly, "If you like, I'll help you put them on." In desperation, I grabbed the restraints, slammed the door shut, and turned on the light. She had thrown a robe over her beautiful body and was sitting on the edge of the bed. She asked, puzzled, "What's going on?" I said, "I don't know. We have to go up to the lifeboat deck. I can't imagine them doing lifeboat drills at such an ungodly hour, but I guess they are." In the beginning, seabirds soared overhead as we rounded Clark's Point out of Buzzard's Bay. It was a dazzling early summer day, bright blue sky, a few white puffy clouds. The trees were bright green. The waves crashing on the rocky beach added a contrasting frothy hue. The wind was tailwind, and we were making our way on the jib and jib. The Ansel Gibbs was hunting sperm whales in the South Atlantic, and the hold was full. That's a big payday, and I was entitled to a good chunk of it as ship's master. Life was good. It was rare for a 20-year-old to become a harpooner. But I had grown up in New Bedford, where whaling was a religion, and it had been in my blood from an early age. Like most boys, I wanted to be just like my old man. He was the captain of the ship Cicero, a huge guy with fierce blue eyes and a weathered face. I never really knew him. He was away all the time. But I shared his love of adventure. When I was a kid, he gave me a toy harpoon. I think someone carved it out of whalebone. I just had to try it. So one morning, I snuck up on the cat as it was sunning itself by our window. I didn't hurt it much, just poked it in the butt. But my mom remembers me yelling, "Pay up, Mom," she sounds, and the cat, shrieking, ran down the street. By the time I was 14, I was blonde, blue-eyed, and larger than most of the men on my first team. I had my Viking ancestors to thank for that, but I had spent every year since my hair had started to grow on strengthening my back and arm muscles. I knew I had to be stronger than everyone else if I wanted to pull a harpoon paddle. During the 3 voyages, I managed to move from the cockpit to the steering compartment, where the experienced workers slept, and I was only 20 years old. To put it mildly, I was very pleased with myself. I stood on the rail, holding onto one of the spars while Isaac, the helmsman, led us into the dock. I tossed the stern mooring line to the waiting loaders, and they pulled us up to the pier. Mr. Gibbs was already waiting for us with a trunk of money. Gibbs seemed unusually happy to see us. Like our arrival was a surprise, it was weird. I also wondered where Gibbs got the money. Of course, New Bedford was a hotbed of the factoring business. Essentially, a speculator bet a certain amount of money that the value of a shipment would be more than the amount he paid the owner. It was a form of insurance. That must be why Gibbs was already a hot commodity. Gibbs got half the profits. But he still put almost $1,000 in gold in my hand. That was my share. He said, "That's a lot of money for a young man." It should be. That's over a year of dangerous and grueling work. The afternoon was getting hot as I walked down the gangway with my sea bag over my shoulder. I must have looked like an Indian. The tropical sun burns a man to a brown color. We had only been away for a couple years, which was a mere trifle compared to the Pacific hunts, but for newlyweds, it was a long absence. The waiting crowd was sparse. That didn't surprise me. When a whaler goes out of commission, it's almost impossible for the homies to stay in touch. I looked around the dock for Faith. I didn't see her. I did see Faith's mom and sister, Julia. I approached them with a cheerful smile on my face and money in my pocket and asked, "Where's Faith?" That's when I noticed the stares. My mom was not one of those warm and loving moms. She was a tough woman with a serious husband. She looked me over as if evaluating me. Then she took my hand and said, "Let's go inside, Jacob. There are a few things you need to know." My old man was a whaling ship captain, so we were rich. It didn't help my trade. But I grew up in one of those mansions on County Street. As we walked from the dock, not a word was said. I thought, my God, where's Vera? I grew up with Faith Polk. She was literally the girl next door. My father was the captain of the ship Cicero, and her father was the master of the ship Charles W. Morgan. They were friends and partners in whaling. Their stately homes stood side by side on County Street, on the high ground. Most of the time it was just Vera and me. There were boys in our neighborhood, but none of them were as adventurous as my little buddy. We were about 6 years old when we started exploring the many interesting places along the Acushnet River. We would go out all day with a basket looking for duck eggs and come home all muddy. Faith was just a baby. But she was as fierce and brave as her father, who was a legend among Pacific whalers. By the time I was 10, I had a rowboat, and I'd take us around the Acushnet in search of pirate gold, hostile Indians, or any strange creatures, porcupines, beavers, or skunks. Fortunately, we never encountered any of these things, but there was excitement in trying. When we were growing up, our parents made sure we learned to read, count, and do math. They even talked about me going to New Haven for college. But it killed Faith and me to sit in a one-room schoolhouse when there were new adventures ahead. So more often than not, we disappeared into Clark's Cove and didn't come back until after dinner. When we hit puberty, a drastic change took place. By the time I was 14, I was ready for my first journey, big, strong, and able to do a man's job. Faith had changed too. As a child, she had been as thin and strong as a fox. Now she was a fox with a gimmick that swelled as wide and full as the mainsail of a whaling brig. We had a small group of friends. New Bedford wasn't Boston. But Faith and I were part of what was considered society there. So we attended various social gatherings and cotillions. It was just to learn the basics of adult life, nothing vulgar. That all changed when the sap started to rise. Suddenly, my little buddy had admirers. Faith was naturally shy, and the newfound male attention made her uncomfortable. So she clung to me even tighter. None of the other boys would mess with me. I was bigger than most of their fathers. So I became Faith's protector, and eventually her lover. It was after my second voyage. I was 17, almost 18, when I went whale hunting. It was on Faith's father's ship, the Charles W. Morgan. They are called right whales because they are easy to hunt and they get a lot of oil out of them. It was a short voyage, only 5 months in the Bay of Fundy. I was then a deck sailor, living in a foxtail, pulling the oar of a whaling ship and doing all the chores. For the whole voyage I made $35, but that's how I learned to run a ship. Faith was waiting on the dock when we docked. I assumed she'd come to see her father. I was amazed at how much my little friend had changed. She used to have a round, snotty face with huge, wide-set blue eyes and long blonde pigtails. Now that face had lengthened into a model of beauty. Beautiful high cheekbones, a straight nose, a sharp chin, and full kissable lips. Faith was wearing a light linen dress. It was hot, and she was sweating, so it was tight. When we landed, she rushed past her father and threw herself into my arms. I grabbed her and hugged her, surprised. She said, "Oh, Jacob, I missed you so much." And this in front of her father and the other men who cast glances at her. After all, we'd been at sea for almost 6 months, and a fock was no place to be bullied. I looked into her face and she cried. I said, "I love you, Faith." I didn't plan it. I just blurted it out. But I knew it was true as soon as I said it. She said, "I love you too," and we kissed. It gave me 5 minutes of male grief, but it was worth it, for from that moment it never occurred to us that we would not be married. The marriage was solemnized at Grace Episcopal Church on the 12th day of May in the year of the Lord, 1857. We were both 18 years old. New Bedford wasn't as puritanical as the neighborhoods around Boston, but that didn't mean we were allowed to go beyond the occasional hug. Those restrictions were set aside as soon as we said yes. Our parents were rich, so they put us up in a little cottage in Acushnet Heights. It was a nice 3-room cottage with a big stone fireplace and a beautiful porch. The sea breeze was refreshing as we sat in the rocking chair. On our wedding night, I returned from a nightcap and found my new wife in a flannel nightgown, pillows tucked under her back. Moonlight through the window illuminated the sleek brass bed. It was a wedding gift from my grandparents. She looked at me timidly as I prepared for the feast. I might have been a boatman's apprentice and a wizard with a harpoon, but I was as nervous as she was. For 2/3 of our lives, we were almost exclusively companions, but this was by far our finest moment. We had kissed before that, of course, but they were light displays of affection. We both realized that today's event was something completely different, and neither of us was experienced enough to even know how to make the first move. Faith was lying on her back, staring at me with a tinge of fear in her eyes. I lowered my face to her lush lips. The spark flared instantly. The closeness we'd shared as children brought a surge of confidence. I just looked at my new wife in amazement, just like you, my dear viewer, can listen, with your amazement, to the full version of this story on our Patreon, because I had to my regret, cut part of this scene due to some YouTube rules. Humans have a few basic instincts, and I needed one of them right now, so I just acted. After all the sounds died down, we lay there, exhausted. Eventually, I regained my sanity to look at her sweet face. She was looking at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. I think she was worried that her animalistic behavior would somehow alienate me. I looked her straight in the eyes and said in a voice filled with emotion, "We've loved each other since we've been messing around in Acushnet. That just seals the deal. You're mine forever." A jubilant expression appeared on her face and she replied, "That's all I've ever wanted, my love." Over the years, I have remembered the short period after our wedding as the best days of my life. Everything existed in a cozy haze of companionship, love, and passion. But whaling was in my blood, so I knew that sooner or later I would have to go back to sea. Faith didn't want me to leave. She kept urging me to take a job as a digger in her father's office. Her father, Jedediah Polk, had 3 ships and a thriving whale oil business. I could make more money as a broker, and that would allow me to stay ashore. But that wasn't an option. I was young, and a sleigh ride to Nantucket was impossible to pass up. I'll be gone for a few years, and so my decision to go whaling caused my wife some resentment, which puzzled me. She had grown up in New Bedford and should have known what it was like to be married to a whaler. I said, "Look, Faith, your parents have been together for almost 30 years, and they're happy, even though your father has been on 3-year business trips the whole time." She looked at me skeptically. Then I added, trying to reassure her, "You'll be well taken care of, and it won't be forever. I'm saving up to buy my own crew, and we can live off the income from other people's work. You'll just have to be patient for a few more years." She looked at me pleadingly and said, "I want a husband, not the skipper of a whaling ship." I appreciated her words. Faith had always been energetic and adventurous, but she needed me like a fish in water. I turned to the practical side of it. I said, "We can travel together when I have my own ship. Then we will be able to see and do what we have always dreamed of. This is the beginning of the great adventure we have always dreamed of." She asked warily, "When will it be?" I replied seriously, "No more than 3 flights if they are successful. Maybe 6 to 8 years." Faith looked defeated, almost frightened. I should have realized. In a way, she loved me too much. That period of time must have seemed like a hopeless eternity to her, especially when she was so young. Hunting a 60-foot creature is a dangerous endeavor. Yet we had both grown up in New Bedford, and whaling trips were as much a part of our world as eating, sleeping, and going to church. So there was no arguing. Faith just accepted that I was going hunting, because that was what men in whaling cultures did. Thus, I enlisted on the ship Ansel Gibbs as a bosun. The offer of the bosun's position helped me make my decision. I wanted to become a captain like my father, and this was a decisive step forward. I was only 18, and I became the youngest harpooner in the whole town and a rising star in whaling. Boys my age envied me hungrily. On my first 2 voyages, I worked with Jimmy Fawkes. On the Gibbs, he was also assigned as mate. He was a buddy when it came to ship's routine, but he was lazy and unhealthy from birth, so he would never be more than a sailor. He said, "We could be without a couple of years. What are you going to do with your pretty wife?" I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He laughed and said, "She's the most beautiful woman in the whole town. You don't think the other guys won't call once you're out of sight, do you?" I gave him a hard look and said, "It doesn't matter. Faith won't give them the time of day. She loves me. So shut up, or you'll get the same thing I'll give to any guy who messes with her." But he was right. There were a lot of slick businessmen in New Bedford, many of them the same age as Jimmy and me. I knew any one of them would have given an eye for Faith, but the hint that any of them might lead her astray made me furious. Wives waited for their husbands. It was their duty. The hunt was in an area between the Falklands and the South Sandwich Islands. We stopped at Stanley in the East Falklands where we had heard about the open ocean population. When we entered the harbor, there was a Concorde loaded with oil from the hunt. On their advice, we harvested 9 huge beasts in just a few months. The hunts themselves were dangerous. You are in an open 30-foot rowboat, and you have to get within 20 yards of a whale in order to harpoon it. Then you have to wrestle with a 70-ton creature that doesn't take much pity on your attempts to end its life. But we had experienced hands, and we knew what we had to do to survive. In fact, the only real threat was on the way out. We got caught in a hurricane as we were passing east of Hatteras. We didn't know it at the time, but the ferocity of this hurricane was the talk of the entire East Coast. It was particularly strong, with killer winds. Many ships were lost. We would have been among them if it hadn't been for a little luck. We managed to duck to the west, leeward, and pass through inlet into Pamlico Sound. We would have all drowned if we had been a little farther north at the shoals off Cape Hatteras. Beyond the barrier islands, the wind eased, and we were able to make our way to Ocracoke. Most men would have insisted on not following their mother but hurrying home to their bride. But the thought never crossed my mind. People did what their mother told them to do. She was bossy. We walked silently up the hill toward County Street. Mother paced grimly beside us. Julia seemed to be crying. I began to worry. Where was Faith? We entered the parlor. I knew immediately that something auspicious was coming. The only time we used the parlor was for weddings and funerals. Mom sat me down in one of her ghastly carved wooden armchairs, and she and Julia sat across the hall on her horrible horsehair couch. Julia clasped her hands together painfully. The mother began without preamble. She said, "We have been informed that Gibbs's ship was lost in the hurricane of '57. I said, "Then I can see why the town was surprised to see us." The mother looked sinister. She said with contempt in her voice, "It was Esau Briggs who brought us the news. He said he heard about it in Baltimore." Briggs was one of our old acquaintances. His father was an oil speculator and investor. Briggs Jr. traveled up and down the coast, buying up options on the proceeds of the voyages. I said, "He was almost right. We experienced that in Ocracoke, but it was almost a fluent experience." And then it hit me. I asked, "Are you really upset about this news?" Mom looked even gloomier, if that's even possible. She said, "Most of us are used to it. We've been through it before. Your fiancé, on the other hand, has not." She added even more ominously, "That news almost killed Faith. We told her it was just a rumor, and nothing could be said for sure until you got back. But she couldn't be consoled." My mother stopped and looked at me almost with pity. Then she continued with fury in her voice. Esau Briggs devoted all his time to soothing her. Julia burst into tears. I was at a loss for words. I said, "Did Briggs comfort Faith?" And then it hit me, "No, this can't be happening." The mother said with intense anger, "It's not easy for me to tell you this, son, but Vera died in childbirth 2 months ago. It was the shame that killed her." It took a moment. Catastrophic news is like that. The implications take time to seep into your brain. Mom saw my face. She added hastily, "Briggs is in France. You'll never find him. Everyone knew you wouldn't leave him alone." Then she looked at him sternly and said, "I don't need to tell you that this is God's judgment, so accept it." And added in a kinder tone, "Faith is buried in the Congregational was clearly a madam, entered with a couple of black-clad porters carrying buckets of water. They began pouring hot water into the tub, and I recognized the feel of boiled lobster. The lady was getting ready while the two men were doing it. I wondered how a woman could do this with 3 men in the room, but it seemed that the 2 porters were invisible to her, as they were undoubtedly slaves. The woman looked at me greedily. She was about 40 years old, but she was the sweetest woman I had ever seen. I admired her. I thought she looked chubby in the dress. Much to my dismay, because of YouTube, I had to cut that part out, but I remind you that you can listen to the full version with a 7-day free subscription in our exclusive community on Patreon. A sight like her was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, especially since I hadn't been with a woman in over 2 years. So it's understandable what happened to me next. Coming to my senses, I turned and looked at her. She was lying on her back and whimpering, one hand over her eyes. She opened one eye and looked at me in surprise. Then she got up, kissed me, and said, "That was epic." I was amazed. I knew that for them it was business, not pleasure, and they certainly don't kiss. I rolled over onto my stomach, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. She said hoarsely, "Where did you get those muscles, darling? I've never been with a man with a back, shoulders, and arms like yours." I said nonchalantly, "I've been a whaler all my life. That's what you become if you're good with a paddle and a harpoon." She replied coquettishly, "What's a whaler to do in New Orleans? We don't have whales here." I said, "I was transported on a slave ship that tried to get past the patrols on Lake Pontchartrain last night. They still import slaves from Africa, you know, even though it's outlawed." I heard a grim voice say, "I know. If that double-headed eagle is from the slave trade, I don't want it." I laughed and said, "On the contrary, they needed to evade paying taxes, so they threw me and a few others ashore, along with the men they had kidnapped. I dropped them off at Bayou Sauvage, and they were on their way to the fugitive settlement when I last saw them." She gave me a dazzling smile. I grinned and said, "I imagine John Quincy Adams is looking for me at the moment." She looked at me incredulously. "Do you seriously mean to say that the great abolitionist was the captain of a slave ship?" I laughed and said, "I don't think that's his real name, but if he finds me, I'll forfeit my life." She said, "You can stay here as long as you want, my handsome boy. Perhaps I will find a use for you." Into the eyes of a sperm whale. He was taller than I was, over 6'2", and must have weighed about 280. He was completely bald, with a beard that looked like a bushy head of hair slid down to his chin. He had wicked piggy eyes and was missing an ear, which could have been due to a scar across his face. He wore a tattered captain's coat with a swallowtail, and smelled like a bilge after a long voyage in the tropics. He laughed unpleasantly and said, "Welcome aboard, sailor. I wanted to introduce myself." I wiped the blood from my mouth and asked incredulously, "Who are you, and what the hell am I doing here?" The giant laughed, made an ironic bow and said, "John Quincy Adams at your service, and you've just joined the triangle trade." The obnoxious guy in front of me was clearly not the 7th President of the United States, but I got the joke. John Quincy Adams was nicknamed the Abolitionist, and the triangle trade was still going strong, even though it had been banned in England and America for more than half a century. Cotton and rum went from the United States to England, cloth, arms, and trinkets went to Africa, and slaves were shipped to the United States. But if successful, one could get extremely rich. Of course, the profits went to all the owners. No one in their right mind wanted to take a slave on board. The only thing a crewman got was regular beatings or hanging on a yoke if caught. I was just lucky they found me passed out when they were looking for someone to kidnap. The captain said, "You're a sailor. What do you do?" I said, "None of your business," for which I got another punch in the mouth. I reluctantly said, "I was a navigator." He looked at me skeptically and said, "You're too young to be doing this, aren't you?" I angrily replied, "I don't care what you think. My wife is dead, and I'm going to join her." Adams took on a beatific expression, chuckled, and said sardonically, "I can help you with that." So I became XO on the good ship Princeton College. It was so named because Adams claimed to have been a student there. Perhaps he was. He was a very smart man, except he was also creepier than a bell tower full of bats. He could quote Latin phrases, or at least I think it was Latin. I spoke almost no English, so foreign languages were beyond me. But when it came to humanity, he was a total dunce. Adams hated everyone. The ship I was on was a 90-foot brig with square rigging and weighing 207 tons. The crew was 20 men, which was dangerously small for a ship of that size, and I was one of the few experienced sailors. So in good or bad weather, I was the one who was sent to the upper deck to pull the sail on the topgallant. It was the most dangerous job on the ship. The swaying of the mast increased there, and the deck was far below. I was chained up while we were loading and unloading at Plymouth. It was below deck where the African cargo was stored. I was bound to another unfortunate man. He too had joined the crew by kidnapping, only he was a landman whom they dragged off the pier on the Chesapeake while they were loading tobacco. The manatees kept us from jumping ship. They had plenty of them, given the ship's true purpose. We did become friends. I suppose it was a brotherhood of suffering. We were in the same boat, both literally and figuratively. We talked for hours in the darkness of the hold. His name was Springfield, and he called himself a preacher, which meant he had no useful skills. But he could read and hold an intelligent conversation. He had never had a woman in his life. Being frail and poor was not the best way to attract a girlfriend, so he was very interested in my situation. I told him about Vera and her betrayal. He said, "But your wife thought you were dead, didn't she? If you were dead, she would no longer be bound by marriage vows." That was very hurtful. I wanted Faith's act to be deliberately immoral, not the result of an unfortunate misunderstanding. Springfield asked, puzzled, "Do you think this guy made that story up?" I was sure the vile son of a bitch had fabricated it. Every young man in New Bedford wanted to stick his hand out to Faith. But unfortunately, there was hard evidence to the contrary, because we'd almost crashed. I don't know if it made me feel better or worse that Briggs's lies were based on truth. Briggs was always drooling over Faith, just like the rest of the New Bedford boys. She was far from the prettiest girl in our social circle. I smiled bitterly and said, "No, there was truth in that." I added, "Remember that big storm that came through the coast a couple years ago?" He nodded and said, "Yeah, I was lucky I was spreading the word in Fredericksburg. Otherwise, the eastern shore was nearly blown away." I said, "My ship was hit. We made it to safe harbor, but many others didn't." Springfield said, "So your wife wasn't so unfaithful in assuming you were lost at sea?" I nodded miserably. I knew Briggs was a snake in the grass, but Faith always saw the best in people. She'd be easy prey for his seduction, especially if she thought I was dead. I'd be lost if the situation was reversed. I said, "No, she wasn't, but she still had no right to let that reptile into her house." Springfield said, "Maybe she was just looking for another man. You know how women are. They want a man who will take care of them." That was the conventional wisdom in those days, but I wasn't sure that was the case with Vera. My wife was very energetic, but I knew that she tended to think with her heart, not her brain. I also knew that she truly loved me and would need a lot of comforting. That's if I was really dead. Briggs must have used that. Springfield said, "Whatever the reason, you cannot blame yourself. A man must be true to his nature. A sailor must go to sea. But there is nothing wrong in your wife's act either. She could have mourned you a little longer, but she actually thought she was a widow." I said angrily, "But I wasn't dead. She just didn't listen to other women. Faith was always a pig as soon as she got something on her mind. They all told her to wait." The vision of Faith squirming with that bastard haunted me at night. Springfield said, "What did you do with that guy Briggs?" I said, "Unfortunately, nothing. His father hid it in Europe so that it would be out of my reach. Of course, the scandal of what he did to my wife probably had something to do with his desire to leave town. I vowed that someday I would find him and settle accounts with him." After that, my reality consisted of 2 seconds of the past and 1 second of the future. That's all I could think about. Even stranger, I was completely devoid of emotion. I knew I should feel something, but it was as if all the reactions had been boiled out of me, like we boil oil out of a whale. There was nothing left, no fear, no sorrow, no remorse, no feelings. I was an empty man. My soul had shrunk to a husk. It is said that the opposite of love is not hate. It's total indifference. That's how I felt about life. That's how I seemed brave to others. I was willing to do anything dangerous because I just didn't care. The voyage to the Guinea coast and back by the middle route was a living hell. First, I had to endure the sight of 38 poor souls being driven into our boats by their own countrymen to be chained down below in the hot hold. I understood that slavery was the foundation of the Southern way of life, and I believe that if you are going to buy and sell another human being, you must have a hard-hearted mindset. But still, the inhumanity of it was beyond my comprehension. That is, until I witnessed it. It certainly sounds naive, but you have to understand. I grew up in New Bedford, where the only people of color were Indians. I knew some black whalers. They were some of the best harpooners and boatmen on the crew. And believe me, skin color doesn't matter when you're fighting something twice as big as your boat. So the sight of people like my former comrades being loaded into our hold like animals horrified me. A few braver souls, including myself, tried to improve their situation a little. Whenever possible, we smuggled fresh water and food to them. But there was nothing we could do about the situation, except endure along with them. You may reproach me for not doing more, but I was as much a prisoner on that ship as the Africans. Adams had 6 guards, all as brutal as himself. They were all armed, and any infraction carried punishment. Adams even ended the life of one man for quoting St. Paul about slavery. It was black as pitch, hot and humid as we glided along the Louisiana coast. I was the helmsman, as I was one of the few experienced helmsmen. Hot lightning illuminated heavy clouds in the northwest as we passed through the Straits of Rigolets. It was an ominous omen. I heard Adams tell his compatriots that we would drop our cargo, in his words, at Mandeville on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. I supposed the slave traders would meet us there. It was 30 miles in a straight line across the lake from New Orleans. New Orleans was home to the largest slave market in the United States. But since the importation of slaves from West Africa had been banned in 1808, we certainly could not dock on the Mississippi side of the Mississippi and begin unloading. The people of New Orleans might have welcomed us, but the authorities would have imprisoned us. We fumbled our way in the dark as we crossed the strait. It wasn't an easy time. The Navy patrolled Pontchartrain with armed boats specifically designed to catch smugglers. And although the Princeton College was built for speed, it was a sailing brig. There was no way we could outrun the steamer. We had just passed beyond the tip of Treasure Island into the open lake when we saw running lights from the direction of Chief Mentor Pass and Fort Macomb to the southeast of us. The only reason for the ship to be out at this time of day is to patrol the lake. The boat was traveling along the southeastern shore, and if we continue on the same course we're on now, they'll catch up with us sooner rather than later. I wanted Adams caught, but we were all in deep shit if we got boarded. We picked up the pilot at the entrance to the Rigolets. He had come all the way on oars from somewhere off the shore of Lake St. Catherine. He was a lanky French Creole with a heavy Cajun accent, and he knew more about the neighboring swamps than half the alligators. He whispered, "Tough guy. We can hide in Irish Bayou, yeah." I spun the wheel without consulting Adams. I saw that we'd have to crawl tangentially, off the patrol boat's course. We would have made it too, but some fool on the foredeck was smoking a pipe. He must have been nervous, or maybe he wanted us to get caught. It was only a sulfur match, but it flashed like a beacon in the blackness of that wet night. We held our breath, waiting to find out if he had been seen. The answer came almost immediately. I heard the rumble of the locomotive increase, and the running lights turned toward us. We were just passing Irish Point, and could have hidden in the cove there. But Adams and his guards were in a panic. They hastily gathered their thoughts and devised a plan to load all the contraband onto the ship's whaler, and then sail it back to Baja Sauvage. He could not be hanged if there was nothing incriminating on board. Adams knew I'd pulled the harpoon paddle, so I was the first one he threw overboard. He also threw out the Creole pilot and Springfield, who was practically useless. Then they sailed away, leaving us to deal with a bayou full of alligators, water moccasins, and all sorts of other poisonous nastiness. We had 28 frightened blacks as passengers. In the beginning, there were 38, but 10 died during the journey. That was the usual consequence of being ripped out of your life and then shoved into a monstrously hot and unsanitary room for a few days. So Adams had other things on his mind if he thought I was just going to give him these people back to sell. A few of the captives spoke French, and our Cajun guide eventually calmed them down to the point where we could do some planning. The pilot, so named Delphine, had the same attitude towards slavery as I did. According to him, Bayou Sauvage was full of communities of runaway slaves, so he suggested we take our passengers to a place where they would never be found. So I landed 28 refugees and himself on a hummock with a trail leading back to the bayou. There they could try to rebuild their lives. To my amazement, Springfield joined them. He said he saw the hand of God in the matter and wanted to tell them about it. All I saw was darkness and snakes, but I wished them well. The group disappeared into the night, chattering in their strange language. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I thought I caught a note of hope in their voices. As I paddled in the fog along the shore, the sun rose over the lake. The atmosphere was humid, unlike anything I had encountered in New England. The terrain changed from swamps to farmland. There was still no sign of New Orleans, however. I maneuvered along the coast, looking for a logical place to land. Finally, I came across what looked like a river leading southwest from the lake. There must have been a town at the end of it. This waterway was actually a canal. It had been dug by the French before Jefferson bought the place, 50 years ago. My whaleboat didn't stand out in any way, because even at this early hour there were commercial ships, barges, and other small boats on the waterway. I easily joined the stream heading south. When I got to the end of the canal, there was a turn. I tied up the boat and followed the dusty road. The road quickly changed to cobblestones and had a name, Canal Street. It seemed appropriate. I had finally reached New Orleans. I decided I was going to drive my stake into the ground right there on the spot. There was nothing at home but bad memories. I was wearing the same baggy sailor pants I'd worn when I'd been kidnapped. They had a hidden pocket right next to my family jewelry. This location ensures that you will instantly know of any attempt to take your valuables. You can't trust anyone on the Foca. That's why every sailor has something like this. Fortunately, I had stashed some gold there from my last voyage, before I even knew about the fate. So the whole time I was in Adams's clutches, I had a relative wealth with me. It gave me a chilling thought. By now, Adams had no doubt guessed I wasn't coming back, and he must have guessed I was in New Orleans. Consequently, it was likely that he would scour the city for me, so it seemed appropriate for me to lay low. It was the middle of the day, and I was walking through a place with very peculiar architecture, all those Frenchy balconies and wrought iron fancies. There were narrow streets and nooks and crannies. You could find a good hiding place in them. Logically, the place was called the French Quarter, and it seemed to be one of the older parts of the city. I was wandering down Dauphin Street, right on the edge of the Storyville neighborhood, when I saw a sign on a solid planked stone building in an alley. Men were coming in and out of the front door. Naturally, I assumed it was an inn. I mean, of course it looked like an inn. I needed a good night's sleep and a bath, so I went inside to book a room. As soon as I walked through the door, I realized my mistake. There were beautiful women scattered on the plush furniture like street cats. My first impulse was to avert my eyes. That's what we'd been taught in all those cotillions. But still, the endless abundance of legs in fishnet stockings was too much for my 20-year-old sensibilities. So I just stood there with my mouth open. You might think I'm a naive fool who came to a vacation spot looking for a bed and bath. But this place was unlike anything I had ever encountered. New England was still under the rule of its Puritan forefathers, and such places were kept secret so as not to offend the eyes of the pious. The woman broke away from her business and sailed majestically over him like a clipper ship entering the harbor under full sail. She was older than the collection of girls around her, but she must have been a stunning beauty in her day. She was wearing makeup like the main float in a 4th of July parade, but underneath all that makeup she had a very pretty face. At 6'2", I towered over her by a full foot, but I was intimidated by her confidence. She stood there sizing me up like she was buying a horse. I almost expected her to tap me on the chest and open her mouth to count my teeth. Finally, she said, "What are you all doing here, sweeties?" A gleam appeared in her eyes. I regained my sanity to stammer, "I was just looking for a BB bed and a BB bath." She chirped merrily and purred, "That'll cost you $20 in gold, sailor." I said in amazement, "That's a lot of money for a room." She laughed her strange laugh, which reeked of pure lust, and said, "We provide a small room together with a bed and hot water, mon cher." I said yes. Then she turned to the pretty, swarthy girl who crouched beside her and said, "Marie-Aimée, would you take this Yankee up to his room and give him a bath?" The new woman was slender, with long, gorgeous legs and sleek hair the color of a crow's wing. But the real wonder was her face. She was a rare exotic beauty with huge dark eyes, perfectly proportioned facial features, and a good figure. One would have to be stone cold not to react to her presence. I inhaled her musky scent. She smelled like magnolias. She moved with the easy feline grace of a jungle hunting cat, natural and fluid, yet purposeful. She was almost trotting. She opened the door to the room and led me inside. Right in the middle of the room was a large galvanized tin bathtub. I nervously asked, "So you work here?" I still couldn't get my head around the fact that an amazingly beautiful woman like this could work in a place like this. She threw me a pitying look, as if she couldn't believe I was allowed to walk around without a keeper. She said in a soft voice with a Cajun accent, "That's life. Now lie down in that tub, Cher. We'll get you some hot water and soap." I was a little embarrassed in front of the lady. Besides, I wanted to make sure that my stash of gold coins would stay with me. So I waited until the stunning creature slipped out of the room. Then I stuffed everything under the mattress. I was sitting in the tub in my birthday suit when the first woman, who was clearly a madam, entered with a couple of black-clad porters carrying buckets of water. They began pouring hot water into the tub, and I recognized the feel of boiled lobster. The lady was getting ready while the two men were doing it. I wondered how a woman could do this with 3 men in the room, but it seemed that the 2 porters were invisible to her, as they were undoubtedly slaves. The woman looked at me greedily. She was about 40 years old, but she was the sweetest woman I had ever seen. I admired her. I thought she looked chubby in the dress. Much to my dismay, because of YouTube, I had to cut that part out, but I remind you that you can listen to the full version with a 7-day free subscription in our exclusive community on Patreon. A sight like her was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, especially since I hadn't been with a woman in over 2 years. So it's understandable what happened to me next. Coming to my senses, I turned and looked at her. She was lying on her back and whimpering, one hand over her eyes. She opened one eye and looked at me in surprise. Then she got up, kissed me and said, "That was epic." I was amazed. I knew that for them it was business, not pleasure, and they certainly don't kiss. I rolled over onto my stomach, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. She said hoarsely, "Where did you get those muscles, darling? I've never been with a man with a back, shoulders, and arms like yours." I said nonchalantly, "I've been a whaler all my life. That's what you become if you're good with a paddle and a harpoon." She replied coquettishly, "What's a whaler to do in New Orleans? We don't have whales here." I said, "I was transported on a slave ship that tried to get past the patrols on Lake Pontchartrain last night. They still import slaves from Africa, you know, even though it's outlawed." I heard a grim voice say, "I know. If that double-headed eagle is from the slave trade, I don't want it." I laughed and said, "On the contrary, they needed to evade paying taxes, so they threw me and a few others ashore along with the men they had kidnapped. I dropped them off at Bayou Sauvage, and they were on their way to the fugitive settlement when I last saw them." She gave me a dazzling smile. I grinned and said, "I imagine John Quincy Adams is looking for me at the moment." She looked at me incredulously. "Do you seriously mean to say that the great abolitionist was the captain of a slave ship?" I laughed and said, "I don't think that's his real name, but if he finds me, I'll forfeit my life." She said, "You can stay here as long as you want, my handsome boy. Perhaps I will find a use for you. It's a business." Chapter 2. That's how I met May Bailey. She was orphaned after her parents died during one of the periodic yellow fever epidemics in New Orleans. But her beauty was already in full glory. So she immediately caught the eye of Joseph Samuel, a wealthy cotton merchant. He adopted her, even though she had already turned 18, and kept her in luxurious style in a house in the French Quarter. In the Big Easy, the attitude is quite different. So to have a mistress as young and stunningly beautiful as May was, is a badge of honor for her benefactor. Then Samuel died. It has been suggested that his extensive heart failure might have had something to do with the great difference in their ages and his infatuation. But May was an indestructible woman, and she had her own famous beauty to lean on. So she quickly found herself another cotton magnate named Herman. He was even older and richer than her previous conqueror, and May made a deal that the house would pass to her upon his death. The man's inevitable demise came 3 years later. He was buried with a smile on his face, and May received the property and some money. May told me that she was tired of being taken care of by men. She had no marketable skills, other than what she had acquired during her 7 years as a professional mistress. So she went with her strength. She turned her new residence into an upscale knockout shop that attracted the wealthy planters and merchants of the area. The talent she collected ranged from poor Creole girls to unruly daughters. They were all the colors of the rainbow, including red and yellow. But they all had one thing in common. Like May, they were exceptionally beautiful. In fact, by the time I met her, May was something of a New Orleans legend. She even had a House of Ill Fame license from the city. May might be rich and powerful, but she couldn't have children. She told me this information one crying night. She said she liked me because she imagined I looked like the son she would never have. That statement was more than disturbing. I didn't know what to say. My only experience with a woman had been with Vera, and inevitably, at that thought, I experienced a flash of painful regret. So I did what I would have done with my ex-wife. I stroked May's back and hugged her while she cried. I said quite seriously, "You know, the priest might have a problem if I were really your son?" She looked at me sadly and said, "I know, dear boy. It's just that I have grown very fond of you in my own way, and it's time for you to go." This was news to me. I asked, puzzled, "Go away. Where am I going?" May smiled welcomingly and said, "I have an arrangement with one of my girls. We're going to open an establishment in Denver. There's gold there, and we're going to split the profits. That's if I provide the stock." I had visions of cattle drives. I asked, "What does this have to do with me?" May replied, "It's a long and dangerous journey. That is why I am sending you along with Patrick to see to it that they get there." Patrick was the very essence of a smiling Irishman. I liked him. He was 10 years older than me, and he had one of those classic Irish faces: hooded eyes, long narrow nose, bushy eyebrows, and an accent that hinted at thievery and good cheer. He came here during the Great Famine and made his way in every way he could. He worked as a bartender downstairs, serving booze and brambles as much as I did upstairs. I may have been a little resentful of being unceremoniously kicked out of the nest, but I was excited at the prospect of new adventures. It had been almost a month since I'd walked through May's door. We weren't sure if Adams was still looking for me, so I was confined to the upper floors of the house and tried to remain invisible. At night, I spent time with Madame, but we were both getting uncomfortable. I had always been daring, and a trip to the Wild West was just the sort of prospect I could sink my teeth into. Even if only as trail boss for a herd of women moving westward, I would miss May. But we both knew our interlude wouldn't last long. I was 20 years younger than she was, and she was a madam. So a week later, we traveled upriver on the steamer Natchez, our destination, Hannibal, Missouri. It was my first trip on a steamboat, and it was amazing. The large stern oars were turned by a powerful engine in the bow of the boat. It puffed and puffed against the current, making as much as 5 knots. That was a miracle in itself, for a sailor like me. The steam clearly had a future. May saw us off at the cotton docks at the end of Ursuline Avenue. She hugged me goodbye and said, "Be good, my beautiful boy. I'll never forget you." Was that a tear in her eye? May Bailey may have been a night butterfly and a madam, but she was a strong and independent woman, and one of the kindest and noblest souls I have ever known. She sailed on her own star and never moved an inch in her whole life. It was obvious that May was helping me get out of town. Fate has a sense of humor after all. Who would have thought I would escape by sending a party of women on a 1,000-mile journey to the Promised Land? There were 8 girls in our group, all stunningly beautiful. 2 of them, Aphrodite and Bathsheba, were former slaves. Lynn was exotically oriental. Abigail was a planter's daughter. She seemed to enjoy her work. Then there were 3 Mexican beauties, Itzel, Nellie, and Tepin. They were sisters from Veracruz, sold into the trade by their parents. And finally, there was Marie Aimée. She called herself Amy, as all Cajun girls carried the name Virgin Mary. She was May's business partner. I hadn't seen her almost since I arrived. She'd been around for a while. But while I was in hiding, she kept a low profile. I think she was told to stay away. It's since become clear that I find her deadly attractive. Amy was a Louisiana Creole who was called a quadroon by the locals. This meant that one of her grandparents was black. This fortunate amalgamation resulted in a woman of magical beauty. She had a pointed, intellectual nose over a stunningly sensual mouth, thick, silky, raven-colored hair, framing a classic facial oval, a high, intelligent forehead, and beautiful eyes of a dark shade of purple. Yes, I said purple. The contrast between Amy's golden skin and her expressive eyes was so striking that men would literally stop and stare at her as if mesmerized. In addition, an indescribable fragrance emanated from her. Perhaps it was voodoo sorcery, or perhaps it was just Amy. Whatever it was, it turned all the men around her into drooling idiots, including me. As I noted, she was 5'6" and had a cat-like good body. She moved like a panther in a bayou. May dressed me as if I were her child. The clothes were stylish and sophisticated, right down to the ruffled shirts and the cane. Underneath, however, I was still a former harpooner, and it showed through the dapper outfits. It was the same with the girls. All of our charges were dressed in the finest French fashions and behaved like high-born ladies, just as May had taught them. Nevertheless, most of the men on the ship guessed who they were. So Patrick and I had to work hard to convince the male passengers not to touch the merchandise. I was larger than most, 6'2" and 220 pounds. So all I had to do was gently encourage good behavior. Patrick was a fiery carcass 5'7" and 180 pounds, and the Irish would pounce on him if the boys took liberties, especially Aphrodite, whom he seemed to have a thing for. This led to his throwing an important piece of bling into the Mississippi, which nearly got us thrown off the ship. Luckily, they fished it out and Amy smoothed his ruffled feathers. She didn't do it herself. That job was given to Abigail, who was happy to do the task. Seriously, there's something wrong with that girl's head. Natchez pulled into Hannibal, Missouri, like he was parking a wagon. As a sailor, I was disgusted at the ineptitude of the process. They just drove it up to the dock and launched it. We unloaded our cargo, among which were so many trunks and valises that there would have been enough for Napoleon's army on campaign, and then loaded it all into a private car on the Hannibal to St. Joe Railroad line. We then traveled to the port of St. Joe on the Missouri River. The trip by rail took half a day, and early the next morning, we and our charges were loaded on the steamer Excel for the 2-day trip to Kansas City. Kansas City was then called Kansas City, and it did not yet have the trappings of a cow town because the railroad had not yet reached there. It bordered on exsanguinated Kansas. Thanks to the Kansas-Nebraska law, there was fighting all over the area between the bushwhackers and the Jayhawkers. President Buchanan had sent enough federal troops to pacify the area, and we didn't stay there long. We just had to outfit a couple of wagons to hit the Santa Fe Trail. By 1860, the trail had been in operation for more than 30 years. The deep ruts that marked its path testified to the thousands of people who had traveled westward through the Kansas Territory. The train we joined was like a military expedition, with elected officers and armed men to scout and protect the main group. It operated according to a certain routine, rising at 4 in the morning, leaving at 7. We traveled 10 or 15 miles a day, depending on the terrain. We bought a Conestoga to carry cargo. The white cotton sailcloth on the Conestoga is why they were called prairie schooners. It was hinged front and back to better protect the cabin during a storm. That way it looked like a sail. Each wagon held about 2 tons of cargo. Reindeer were preferred, as the larger number of mules needed for traction would have been troublesome to maintain. The Aspens were not manageable with reins, so we hired a couple of boys to walk alongside and steer them. Since schooners on the prairie had no suspension and the trails were rough, most people preferred to walk rather than endure the constant painful jolts and lurching of the wagon. So we bought an overland stagecoach to give the girls basic comfort. It had suspension, and the passengers didn't suffer much bumping and jolting, but it rocked a lot. I sat on the driver's box holding the reins and guiding the mules. Driving was difficult at first. I was a sailor, not a commodore, but if you practice it a few hours a day, you can master anything. I changed my gentlemanly attire to the boots, canvas pants, large neck scarf, and plaid shirt, worn by all the men on the train. This was all complemented by a large Stetson hat to protect me from the weather. I even had a waterproof duster in case the weather became too unfavorable. To my utter amazement, Amy came upstairs with me. It takes courage and stamina to sit for hours in the heat and dust of the Kansas prairie. As a whaler and blue water sailor, I've dealt with hardship all my life. But Amy was by far the most beautiful and exotic of all women. Nevertheless, Amy sat beside me day after day. It was as if she sensed that the endless expanse made me uneasy. I suppose people out west would have felt the same anxiety on the open ocean that was my fiefdom. Her calming presence and quiet strength encouraged me to be the man she needed. Amy wore man clothes when she rode with me. It was just common sense given the harsh conditions. With her attire, she was attracting a lot of stares. In return, Amy looked at the immigrant men with obvious disdain and showed nothing but anger and contempt for their wives. Amy always did what she thought was right and hated petty judgments. In the afternoon, we rode behind the Conestoga. We had to keep up with the oxen. Pat drove the big wagon along with a random team of kids. They made sure the oxen kept in line and kept up. Surprisingly, Aphrodite walked beside Pat the whole time, chatting and laughing. It was comical because Pat was 5'7" and Aphrodite was about 6 feet tall. But apparently, the two had bonded at their previous jobs and were in love in their own way. Pat was Irish, and the Irish suffered from bigotry in those days, whereas Aphrodite was a black-skinned lady of the night. Of course, this caused a storm of moral outrage from the righteous members of the train. Nevertheless, no one ever said anything overtly provocative to them because Pat had already been punished for various misdemeanors. He had a temper. Both Pat and Aphrodite knew that human nature could not be changed. People would believe what they believed, so they ignored the sanctimonious views and enjoyed each other's company. In many ways, it was the best revenge. Amy and I never talked. We just sat there, friendly for mile after mile. It was like she was saying we were in this together. I respected her unwavering spirit, and our partnership grew as we moved west. You might even call it a crush. If such a thing can happen between a traveling sailor and a potential madam. She even cast a friendly glance at me sometimes as we walked side by side. We really were a couple. The route through Kansas followed the north bank of the Arkansas River. The guides called this route the wet route because there was a lot of grass and water. The dry route took much less time, but there was very little water. Only thirsty beavers traveled this route. At Fort Dodge, the trail bifurcates again. There, hurrying people could take the South Fork that followed the Cimarron River. It passed through Comanche territory, and these people are notoriously inhospitable. So those who chose this path often regretted it. We turned at a mountain fork. Every mile was a test of physical strength, even with 6 oxen. The trail itself was a perpetual mess of ruts, mud, and steep climbs. I was one of the biggest and strongest men, and they needed my strength to pull the wagons across the various ravines and fords. After we set up camp, Amy spent all her time with the women. Of course, that was to be expected. Still, I missed her company. The feeling of dissatisfaction was foreign. I hadn't felt intimacy with anyone since the day I'd kissed Faith goodbye. Strangely, Amy seemed as lonely as I was, even as she sat among the crowd of gossiping women. Every once in a while, I even noticed her looking at me thoughtfully, like we were a real couple. I kept telling myself she had the wrong one, but throughout the journey, she was only unwaveringly loyal and reassuring. The presence of 8 gorgeous and clearly the most beautiful women was a problem in a camp full of men. So Pat and I slept under each end of the Conestoga, where the girls were positioned. Under our pillow, we carried 2 fully loaded Colt 44 Army pistols. In the driver's box, we also kept a lever-action Henry 45, 70 caliber repeater, and a 10th gauge shotgun. Our destination was the old Bent's Fort, located on the Arkansas River. It was about 500 miles from Kansas City. From there, we were to turn north on the Cherokee Trail toward Denver. It was another 2 months' journey. We reached the Colorado River, west of Fort Lyon, to where the 2 trails diverge, and camped in a cottonwood forest along the Arkansas River. It was deep into the night. I was about to fall asleep when I heard someone slip stealthily out from behind me, just above my head, and walk toward the riverbank. I hastily pulled on my boots, picked up the Colt, and walked. I felt both anger and curiosity. It was definitely one of the women. But he shouldn't have been alone at this hour. The figure was easy to track. It was one of those classic moonlit starry nights on the Great Plains of Colorado. When the figure reached the riverbank, it knelt down and appeared to be praying. I lurked behind a poplar tree and just watched. All I could hear was the rushing of the river. Then, to my amazement, the choking sobs began. They turned into anguished cries of "Why?" She fell face down on the ground with her hands above her head in supplication and made primal sounds of agony. I jumped out, ready to rush to her. Then it occurred to me that she had chosen that time and place because she wanted privacy. I just needed to wait there and make sure she was safe. So I stepped behind a tree. I was also puzzled. Who was this woman and what was the cause of so much suffering? Finally, the wailing stopped and the woman staggered to her feet. She started up the path past me, still sobbing softly. She came out into the clearing we had created by chopping wood for the fire, and the full moon illuminated her face. My heart almost stopped. It was Amy. I lurked behind a tree and watched her walk by. She never noticed me. Her eyes were downcast. I turned to rush back to the wagon before she discovered what I had witnessed, when suddenly I heard a coquettish voice say, "What are you doing here, little lady?" I recognized the voice. It was Wilbert Cooper, one of the train guards. He was a scruffy-looking fellow, about Pat's height, a shiftless tramp. He was mostly useless, but apparently he was the one assigned to patrol the camp tonight. Amy stopped. She could be seen doing calculations. Her long raven hair was braided, and she was wearing a light change of clothes. She realized she was helpless if this guy got any ideas. Of course, Amy wasn't a mediocre Violet. She was experienced at what she did. She turned and said in a seductive tone, "Just had to do some nighttime business. What's on your mind, Cher?" It was obvious that Amy was just playing for time, but her tone of voice and the way her body shifted killed me. I thought, you know what it is. She's protecting herself the only way she knows how. But the thought of Amy doing something like that as payment for her grief was too strong. So I stepped out from behind the tree and said in a threatening tone, "I've got this cowboy in my hands, so why don't you go back to what you've been doing?" It startled them both. Amy jumped up and covered her face. She began to let out a high-pitched, shrill cry. She realized that I had seen her on the riverbank. Cooper pulled out a fat Navy Colt. He pointed it at me and said with a smirk, "I'm going to accept this gift from her. We all know who she is." The first thing you learn in a gunfight is that the best option is an instant attack, and the more sudden and powerful the better. I had a .44 at my foot, so Cooper thought it was harmless. He knew I wouldn't get a shot off before he pulled the trigger. But what he didn't realize was that the barrel lengthens my already long leg. I stepped to his left. It took him a fatal second to move the barrel of his Colt. That was enough time for me to swing my gun and lift his arm into the air. I followed that up with a crushing blow to his ribs. Something crunched. He yelped and fell backward. Then I lunged at him like an enraged grizzly. I ripped the gun out of his hand, threw it into the thicket, twirled it around, and pinned his arms to his sides. God, he stank. I was already thinking of wringing his neck. He was much smaller than me and wiry and thin, but I didn't want Amy to see that, so instead I said, "Apologize to the lady, cowboy." He hesitated. I tightened my grip. He screamed in agony. I felt his ribs stir. He gasped, "I'm sorry." I let go of him. He staggered and fell to his knees. I gave him a blow to the head that put him out of commission for good. He would have a bad headache in the morning and probably broken ribs, but at least he would be alive. Amy looked at me with clouded eyes, and I realized I had to say something. I spread my hands in a sincere gesture and said, "I wasn't spying on you, honestly. I was spying on you because I wanted to make sure you were okay. That's all. You're very important to me." She looked shocked. Then she gave me a long look and said, "I understand very well. I'll tell you about it someday." With those words, she walked easily past me and climbed back into the wagon. The next morning, Amy was as withdrawn as usual, as if the night before had never happened. Most of the train continued on toward Raton Pass and Santa Fe. But 5 wagons and our stage turned up the Arkansas River. In the direction we were headed, there was a wall of mountains. Fortunately, we were traveling no farther than Pueblo. We will then turn north on the old Trappers Trail, which was the preferred route through the Sierra Madres. The Trappers Trail was 40 years old. It was used by Fremont and Kearny on their early expeditions westward. It led north from Pueblo, along the Rocky Mountain Front Range, east of Pikes Peak, and on across the Continental Divide, between the Arkansas and South Platte rivers. We were making our tedious way across high plains with endless short grass prairie. The terrain looked as if anything with hooves walked on it. Herds of buffalo, deer, even cattle. The Indians remained invisible, which suited me just fine, since this was Apache territory. Water was extremely important in this arid landscape, so the trail ran along a series of creeks. We had been walking for several days, mostly northwest, when we reached a place called Jimmy Camp. Jimmy Camp is a former trading post named for the crude adobe shack that Jimmy Hayes, an early trader, built in a low spot by the creek. It was rumored that he was buried there. Jimmy's camp was known for its crystal clear spring, and there was plenty of grass for grazing, and cool shade provided by pine and cottonwood trees. At this point, the Trapper Trail branched northward, and we planned to reach the Cherry Creek Trail. It ran along a tributary of the South Platte River and led directly into Denver, which is where we were headed. As we approached the end of our journey, I began to feel some serious dissatisfaction. For months, Amy had been my constant companion. She always sat beside me in her skivvies with Henry resting on her lap, self-sufficient and mysterious. A deep bond had developed between us, though neither of us would admit it. However, in reality, my faithful partner was doing her job. I didn't think about whether it was right or wrong. I had righteous indignation to fall back on in the case of Vera. But with Amy, it was never about betrayal. From the moment we met, I knew what her profession was. But on the other hand, my closest and only life partner had to start work as soon as she arrived in Denver, and that kept me on my toes. I even sensed an irony in our circumstances. It was clear that Amy just wanted someone to love, and at the same time, she could never get that love because of what she was doing. This impossible paradox was like a dam holding back the river of our mutual desire. I assumed Amy felt it too, and she kept me at a distance to put us both out of our misery. Still, it made us the closest pair of strangers in the entire West. We'd never said 2 words to each other about our past. But I couldn't imagine the circumstances that could make such a strong and intelligent woman take such a path. I understood why the other women were in the trade. Aphrodite and Bathsheba were free now, but they had been sold to May as slaves. I never knew for sure, but Lynn and the 3 Mexican girls were probably in the same boat. Abigail was the same because she had a few cogs. Nevertheless, what made a strong, energetic, and totally awesome creature like Amy humiliate herself like that? Adding to the mystery was Amy's performance at the riverside a month ago. I'd never seen so much grief in my life. It made the mourning I'd done the day I'd learned of Faith's betrayal seem almost frivolous. Whatever was driving this, it would surely reveal the secret of the woman I had fallen so hopelessly in love with. But alas, I could only find out if Amy told me. Until then, she had not shown the slightest inclination to reveal herself. Most of the time, Amy treated me as if I were her man. She did everything a wife is supposed to do. She cooked and took care of my daily needs. She even washed my union suit from time to time. She said the trip would be much more pleasant if I didn't stink. Women! The only thing she didn't take care of was my wishes, but I didn't expect her to. And it wasn't that she was selling them for money. It was clear that Amy's night butterfly was the armor she wore whenever she had to face the harsh reality of a life red with teeth and claws. The other Amy behaved just the opposite. Random flashes of a deeply devoted and caring woman under the false flag of a fatalistic wench were heartbreaking. After unhitching and tying the mules, I sat in the late afternoon sun and pondered our bleak situation. At that moment, I heard a shot from a 10-bore gun. It came from the direction of the spring. I grabbed both .44 caliber pistols and rushed down the trail toward the sound. There was a rumble of gunfire, followed by shouts and screams. I rushed to the clearing around the spring. When I got there, I found 5 panicked women taking turns. They were clearly bathing, but Amy was pushing the lever of the Henry to fire another shot, and Aphrodite was vigorously reloading the 10-shooter. The sight of the monumental Aphrodite was slightly more intimidating than the huge mountain range to the west of us. I had an inappropriate thought. How is Pat ever going to get over this? Pat had just risen to his feet and was visibly dizzy. A few paces away from him lay what appeared to be a breathless Indian, and from the direction Amy had shot, there were shouts. Everything stopped when I appeared. The girls kept shouting and pointing toward the howlers, which were getting farther away. Amy took one last shot and then walked quickly over to me, clutching Henry in her hands. For the first time ever, I could see that she was excited. She said in a strained voice, "They took my sister. We have to go after her." I said, not understanding, "Sister? What sister?" Amy replied without further explanation, "Abigail." She then turned to run after the departing raiders. I grabbed her hand and said, "Hang on. You won't get far in sandals and a change of clothes. I'll go with you. But we need to do some preparation." I finally admitted that I was willing to do anything for this woman, even face a Comanche raid. I had no idea why golden-haired beauty Amy thought pale patrician Abigail was her sister, but for the first time in my life, I saw a real woman, and she was scared. I looked her over and added calmly, like getting suitable clothing, ammunition, and some food. 15 minutes later, Amy was dressed in her buckskins, and a couple saddlebags with Henry's ammo were slung over the back of her mule. I tried to hold my ground. I'm a sailor, not a cowboy. I had a .44 in 2 holsters. We left the 10-wheeler at Pat's. He promised to take the Conestoga to Denver, and there we would meet him and the rest of the girls. Amy assigned Aphrodite to take her place. It was an excellent choice. She could drive better than I could, and with Aphrodite, no one would be out of line. We rode our mules down the obvious trail the raiders had left, traveling west from the spring to the rugged terrain a couple miles away. There were plenty of ravines for them to hide in, but they kept moving toward the mountains. Amy said there were originally 3 of them. They came out of the thicket of trees behind where they were standing, took Pat by surprise, and hit him with a tomahawk. Apparently, Irish skulls are immune to tomahawks, or the point was blunt, because he just passed out. Pat was talking to Aphrodite at the time, and the 2 of them were talking all the time, so Aphrodite grabbed Pat's 10 gun and shot the one with the tomahawk. Amy ran up to Henry, who she leaned against a tree, and shot the other 2. That convinced them to run, but they grabbed Abigail, who of course was running in the wrong direction. The tracks we were following joined a larger group about a mile into our pursuit, which changed the situation completely. I could probably deal with the original intruders myself, but there was nothing I could do about the whole tribe. We began to walk cautiously down the trail. The trail was made easier by the fact that herbivores were moving along with the group. They were chewing on the ground as we went along. It seemed as if we were following a whole group. We followed them through the night. I was getting used to riding a mule, and Amy rode as if she had been born on a horse. There seemed to be nothing in the physical universe that she couldn't do. The men we tracked were camped on high ground 10 miles north-northwest of where they had abducted Abigail. It must have been a large family. There were several teepees and several campfires. We waited until it was completely dark to sneak to the perimeter of the camp. It was easy because there was a whole bunch of ravines leading there. Amy always carried Henry with her. I thought it was just an act, but she obviously knew how to use it. She was also not shy about crawling over rocks and vegetation like an army scout. We reached the edge of the camp, which was a circle of 6 teepees with a large fire in the middle, and began exploring one teepee at a time. It was absolutely dark, with only the stars and the dying fire illuminating the scene. No one stood guard, but there were a few dogs roaming nearby. The dogs were supposed to sound the alarm if anyone came near. We kept against the wind and moved silently from tepee to tepee. Once in a while we heard movement inside, but there was no sign of Abigail. I began to wonder what we would do even if we found her. We certainly couldn't walk up to 30 or more hostile Indians and politely ask them to bring our little sister back. It was at that moment that the screams of a woman being bludgeoned to breathlessness came from the clearing to our right. It could have been anyone. But Amy immediately jumped to her feet and ran up the path. Perhaps she recognized the screams. I scattered a handful of pemmican and followed her. I thought, this should distract the dogs. When I reached the clearing, I found the two women arguing loudly. Amy was covering one of the two Indians, Henry, and the other was next to Abigail. The Indian who was next to Abigail watched the two women shouting at each other in puzzlement. Apparently, kidnapping had given Abigail great pleasure, and she wasn't about to turn down such a tasty offer of rich men. Had I mentioned that Abigail was in over her head? The gist of Amy's argument was that she had lost her business value, not her sisterly concern. I asked, stunned, "What's going on? Isn't she on her way?" Amy turned to me in annoyance and said, "The little girl likes it here and wants to stay." I said, trying to sound reasonable, "Then why don't we let her?" Abigail added, "Yes," Amy said, "she's my sister. I can't leave her." Abigail replied, "They take good care of me, and I like it here." The two Indians began nodding vigorously. They obviously did not know English, but they understood what Abigail was saying. I said to Abigail, "If we leave you now, there's no turning back. You're completely on your own." Abigail said, "These people care for each other. They are like a big family. I haven't felt this free and happy since Daddy sold Marie-Aimee." Now that was another discouraging piece of news. Amy looked at me with horror. I said as firmly as I could, "So you want to stay here with these people?" Abigail nodded enthusiastically and said, "That is my wish. Now, leave me alone." I took Amy's hand and led her down the trail to where our mules were tethered. She seemed to be crying. The mystery remained long enough. I promised myself that I would get the story out of my beautiful friend as soon as we found a place to sleep. The area we were in was still high mountain plains, but it was close enough to the mountains that there were cliffs and caves. I had no desire to find out what lived in the depths of the cave, but there was a well-weathered area under a sheer cliff that gave us a few feet of shelter. If we built a fire at the mouth, we might be able to sleep without disturbance from the local wildlife, and the Indians seemed to be pacified, thanks to Abigail. In our saddlebags we had flasks of water, pemmican, and coffee. I gathered enough wood to make a fire. Then, while I tucked the mules in for the night, Amy cooked us something hearty, if not gourmet. She still remained mysterious. But in one short day, she'd gone from gorgeous New Orleans fashionista to Kit Carson. We had saddles and blankets to sleep on. It was time to open the curtain, and I said emphatically, "You said you'd tell me about it someday. I think now is the time." Amy didn't work that way. She didn't trust anyone. All pretense left her splendid face. She turned her incredible violet eyes on me and said with an anxious feeling, "You first." So I told her the whole sad story, from my growing up, my fascination with whaling, my inevitable marriage to my childhood sweetheart, to her devastating betrayal. I added, "That night I got drunk and with any luck was dragged off the dock into slavery." Amy looked shocked. Now I knew that slavery was part of her biography. I hastily added, "It took fate and the federal government to free me from that hellish ship." I finished, "I snuck into New Orleans and you witnessed the rest." Then I added grimly, "I made a vow to myself that someday I would settle my differences with Mr. Briggs. That promise is all that is holding me back." She was staring at me intently, and it was like the way winter ice melts on the first warm day of spring. Her hitherto impassive expression changed, and the real woman, the person underneath that feline demeanor, began to emerge. We were sitting on the ground across from each other, a fire burning between us. Amy gave us a confused look, then got up and came over to sit next to me. I turned to her with a questioning look. She took my face in her dainty little hands and kissed me. It broke the dam, and a tidal wave of contained feelings flooded our lives. We sat on saddle blankets that smelled of mule, but as unromantic as the circumstances were, we both knew it had to happen. I had to cut out a little bit of YouTube too, but I'll remind you again that a free trial with the full story is available on our Patreon. Amy is an exotic creature, deep, mysterious, and colorful. She radiates attractiveness just by eating breakfast. You can imagine what she's like when her emotions are stirred. More importantly, there was nothing in the way she reacted to me that suggested to me that she wasn't completely lost in her own desire. Amy wasn't a lady of the night. She was my lover. When sanity finally returned to me, I found Amy lying infinitely very still. She was either coming to or coming to. I turned her over so that she was lying next to me. I raised up on my elbow and looked down at her. Her eyes came back into focus. She was far away. Her first words completely stunned me. she said in surprise. "I've never had that before." It was stupid to say it at such an opportune moment, but I had to say it. I sincerely said, "I love you." The pain in her eyes was unimaginable. She said, "Let me tell you my story first, then you can make a decision." So we lay next to each other in the night, looking up at the stars over the vast Colorado prairie. The fire outlined the edges of Amy's body as she told me her story. In many ways, it was a simple consequence of the society she was born into. But it was tragic. More importantly, it explained everything. The Melancons were wealthy Arcadian planters in rural Baton Rouge. Grandfather Aristide began the tradition of childbirth by giving birth to a baby girl by a beautiful slave girl named Leonie. The child grew up among the household staff, and she in turn inherited her mother's beauty. In fact, the daughter was so beautiful that Aristide's son Augustine took her as his wife, essentially as his left hand. This may seem a bit odd, given that they were half-siblings, but extra-legal marriages to exceptionally beautiful slave girls were common among planters. This made the wives full members of the family. Amy's mother, Marielle, was more of a wife to Augustin than his real spouse, Viola, who was the daughter of a member of the legislature in neighboring Baton Rouge. They were all one big, happy family. Abigail was born to Viola, and Amy was born to Marielle. The two girls grew up together like sisters until they began to turn into women. It was then that their brother Bruno came to their attention. Bruno was in his early 20s, a physical specimen, a legendary leader of the Greenville Rifles, and an all-around corrupter. Amy said, "First there was Abigail. She was 2 years older." I thought, "That explains it." Amy added, "It did something to her. It was like her only raison d'être after that was you-know-what." Amy added sadly, "She willingly came with me to Maze." Amy's mother knew that her daughter would inevitably suffer from Bruno's attentions. She was a generic beauty. That's why Marielle had made a childbirth contract with Augustine. This gave Amy some rights, although both mother and daughter were still legally slaves. Accordingly, at the age of 18, Amy found herself bound to a monster. And of course, since she was a slave, she had to submit to his every fantasy. Her beautiful face took on an expression of absolute disgust when she said, "I will never tell you what he did to me." Her only friend was another slave, a servant boy her age named Nestor. Amy told me that Nestor was a sweet and gentle soul. She would pour out her misery to him in the dark of night, and he would embrace and comfort her. Gradually, the comforting turned into something else. Bruno was beyond thrilled when Amy became pregnant. It would be the first child in the next generation, and he had already chosen a name for Bruno Etienne Melançon Jr. He was even getting better at relating to his mother. That was until a dark-skinned baby was born. It only took a few tries to get the information to find out the perpetrator's name. With those words, Amy rolled onto her side to show me the scars on her smooth back. The revenge that followed was merciless. Nestor was sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama. No one lived long there. The baby was sold upriver. He didn't fetch much. But the purpose was revenge, not profit. And Amy was sold to Maze in New Orleans. Fortunately, it was May. May was a compassionate woman. She emancipated Amy and allowed her to live in semi-luxury. All Amy had to do was entertain a few clients. There weren't that many, and May enforced a strict code of behavior. Amy was always treated well. She paused, and then looked at me intently, wanting me to understand. I was property, not a person. All my life I was disrespected. I had no concept of kindness or even humanity. So, of course I did everything this generous woman told me to do. She was my savior. Amy added aloofly, "Evenings with men were completely impersonal. It was a chore. I was doing it to repay my benefactor and keep a roof over my head." Amy's voice deepened, reflecting her deep grief. There was an absolute void in my heart. I had lost my beautiful baby. My grief was all-consuming. I cried every night and prayed for his salvation. "This is what you saw by the river," she said grimly. "My soul has always been protected in the citadel of myself. It was the only way I was able to survive. People see the walls. They never touch what's inside." Then she looked at me lovingly and said, with a growing note of concern, "I'm not like that. We've been together for almost a year now. You're a good man. You won't hurt me, and you'll protect me." She paused, as if tensing up, and added, "I want to open the gate and let you, and only you, into my heart. But please understand, it would kill me if you betrayed me." I had several thoughts. The first was joy. This gorgeous woman had just told me everything. The second was relief that I wasn't playing the martyr for Faith's betrayal. I would have looked like an idiot compared to Amy's suffering. And finally, I was completely devoted to her. Clearly, Amy was a superb beauty. She would always be a great and caring life partner. But that was not the basis of my choice. Amy's spirit was the deciding factor. The strength of her character and intelligence. Her gallant willingness to fight even in the face of hopeless odds. It was the ingredient that no other woman had. Moreover, Amy was always an honest and caring person. She did not treat others the way they treated her. She gave them empathy and respect. That was what made her remarkable. If I had Amy's life experience, I would have been an axe murderer. It's a business. Chapter 3. So it was easy for me to say with absolute certainty, "You will never regret loving me. I swear that on my grave." The new town of Denver was at the confluence of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River. When we arrived, it was mostly tents. Originally, there was gold in the creek, but the really rich deposits were in the mountains to the west. Still, all the supplies and mining equipment had to come from somewhere. And Denver was the terminus of the Pikes Peak Express. It was the only connection to the east. Thus, it was trade, not mining, that made Denver a boomtown. Of course, no boomtown can consider itself civilized if it doesn't have an upscale place to relax. May was called upon to provide this important service. She, in turn, sent her protege to build relationships. That's why Amy and I ended up there. After our adventure with Abigail and the Indians, we were in no hurry to get back to Denver. The reason it took so long was that we couldn't tear ourselves away from each other, learning more and more information. Besides, we needed to work out the details of our developing relationship. Oddly enough, it was Amy who was inexperienced. I was married. I knew how to be with someone. Amy had never had anything but a brief affair, so she had to get used to living in a close and loving relationship. It wasn't easy at first. For example, Amy was not used to waking up to being hugged. The first time it happened, she jumped to her feet in fright. She was also nervous when I did nice things for her. It was as if she suspected ulterior motives, and she apologized too often. Her behavior was easy to understand. I knew I was completely devoted to her, but she didn't know that. All her life she had been mistreated. Now she had put her soul on the line, hoping I was different, and she could lose everything if I turned out to be like every other man. We talked whenever one of the ghosts from her past showed up on her doorstep. Eventually, each of those ghosts found peace. It was very moving to watch Amy slowly begin to trust me, and these conversations convinced me that she would rather die than betray me, which of course was a bit frivolous given her former profession. And yet, I was more confident in Amy's loyalty than I'd ever been with a normal woman. Amy had experienced the worst that life had to offer. Therefore, she understood the value of her current position and made no assumptions about its permanence. This fact, more than anything else, reinforced my faith in our long-term prospects. When we returned, we found that Pat and Aphrodite were busy. May had bought a plot in the center of town, and our two friends had already pitched a big tent. They were doing a land office. Behind, the frame of a permanent structure was already being erected, and construction was in full swing, for there were many miners who needed a crib. I went down to the Pikes Peak office, while Amy and Pat watched the construction. I had a plan that I wanted to put into action. It was the first fruit of the agreement Amy and I had reached. She was still the manager of the best vacation spot in Denver, but we really wanted to get married, so I had to find a way to support us. My trump card was a stake left over from the last whaling voyage. That was only 3 years ago. At any rate, it was enough to enable me to deceive thousands of fools in their haste to make their fortunes in the gold mines. In fact, in many respects, gold mining was as immoral as my future wife's former profession, and yet much more lucrative. I made an arrangement with a manager at an express service. For a small percentage of the profits, he would deliver the goods. Then I would sell them for 20 times the price. Our arrangement would make us both rich. Amy, for her part, hated being part of May's stable. but she had studied the craft up and down and was a shrewd businesswoman, so she promised to keep an eye on the developing stable until Aphrodite felt confident enough to replace her. She told me it's a male fantasy that women get pleasure from the business they sell. She called it dirty and degrading, but on the other hand, it was necessary to survive. I remembered that she had told me the same thing the first day we met. We lived in a small tent next to the big one. During the day, I did my supply business. And every night, I spent in the main tent with Pat, manning the bar and scaring off rowdy miners. At first, Amy didn't like my presence. Eventually, I took her aside and asked, "Do you love me?" Her strange violet eyes flashed brightly. She replied, "How can you ask me such a question when you have my very soul in the palm of your hand?" I said, "Then why are you acting so aloof? You are supposed to be the owner of this place, not a representative of the local Christian women's organization." She looked at me perplexed and said, "Iya?" I laughed and said, "As if you were here to eradicate all the sins of this profession." She said in horror, "Really? Oh my God." I took her dainty chin between two fingers, tilted her head so that she was looking directly into my eyes, and said lovingly, "I have no doubt that your heart belongs only to me. I also know that you will never betray that love, so get back out there and be as stunningly beautiful as ever." Then I added with a stone face, "Just don't disappear into the back room." Amy looked shocked. Then she saw my face blur into laughter. She made an indignant sound, slapped my arm, and went back to the evening trade. I was there every night, so I would know if Amy had ever tried her hand at her former vocation. She, for her part, was almost pathologically wary of even approaching the back of the tent. It was hilarious to watch her wiggle her way through her hosting duties. And of course, she killed me with her kindness every night. Amy and I were married on July 21st, 1861. It wasn't just the date of our wedding. It was the date of the first Battle of Bull Run. No doubt it was inevitable that people in the East would start a war over slavery. Still, it was surprising when the two parts of the country went from fervent rhetoric to actually shooting at each other. It didn't affect the people in the West one bit. The shipments continued because money had to be made. The miners still brought their gold, and guys who didn't want to fight on either side showed interest in visiting us. Henry James, Mark Twain, William Dean Howells, and even adventurers like Bill Cody have passed through our doors. By then, we had built a swanky vacation spot, and Aphrodite had taken over the role of Mrs. Amy. Amy, in turn, put her steady hand and shrewd business sense into supply management, and thanks to her, we were making more than enough money. One bright and shining summer morning, I walked into a store and saw my wife chatting with an Indian girl. It was such a strange sight that I almost spilled my coffee. Then the Indian girl turned to face me, and I dropped my cup. It was Abigail, and she was thriving. Abigail was still smiling in greeting. Her porcelain blue Southern Belle eyes were calm and peaceful, and she looked happy. The old Abigail was nervous, droopy, and a little puffy. The woman standing in front of me was a woman with rawhide skin, clearly tough and commanding. Amy knew that Abigail's appearance would surprise me, so she quickly added, "Abigail has news for us, honey. You're going to want to hear it." Abigail replied cordially, "It's good to see you, Jacob. You've always been good to me, even though I've been out of my mind most of the time. Now I want to do you a favor." She opened her palm and revealed a strange gray stone that clearly had a gold stitch in it. She said, "Some of the men found it. We have no use for this devilish material, but we know you attach great importance to it." Abigail continued, "I'll show you where we found it. I think it's something you and my sister might need." It made sense. Abigail and Amy were half-sisters, and Abigail had willingly followed Amy when she'd been sold to May. But even after that, we'd followed Abigail when she'd been kidnapped and honored her wish to stay with her captors. So there was a deep connection between us. Maybe Abigail was leading us to something more than just a nugget of gold. So I saddled the mule, kissed Amy goodbye, and followed Abigail, or Heron Woman, as she preferred to call herself now, out of town. The same two Indians were waiting for us higher up the trail. We headed west in the general direction of Clear Creek Canyon. There was active gold mining there, but my guides turned and headed a little north, toward the initial heights of the Front Range. We drove for several hours until we reached a pine-covered cleft in a steep cliff. The day was getting hot, so it was very pleasant when a man got off his horse and walked into the cool shade of the cleft between the rocks. It was about 30 yards wide. He walked some distance and then pointed to the rock, and sure enough, there was a distinct golden seam. I hammered off a small piece with a pickaxe, nodded to him, and we walked back to where Abigail and the other husband. Abigail said thoughtfully, as if she'd been waiting for those words for a long time, "This will repay my debt to you two. You won't see me again. Rest assured, I am happy at last." The three of them turned their ponies and trotted away. I watched them go. Abigail was hurting in her own way, just like Amy. I was glad she was finally at peace. I got back to Denver in the evening and headed straight to the appraiser's office. I wanted to find out how lucky we were. The nuggets in my saddlebags looked pretty rich, so this was clearly a bid I could stake out. The assay office in Denver wasn't just a lone guy in a little shack like most gold towns. It had the staff and equipment to grade the ore that was brought in from the Front Range in a timely manner. I wanted the analysis done quickly, so I turned it over to the head assayer, who was an acquaintance of mine. Then I returned to the luxurious new house we had built with the proceeds from our supply business. Amy was fiddling in the kitchen. She asked with vague interest, "Was there something in there?" Abigail was always too melodramatic. I said, "There was something, but I don't know what." Then I added, "On the other hand, Abigail seems to have found her place in life?" Amy smiled and replied, "Yes, she has 2 manly husbands and a child." I added, to change the subject, "Well, I took what they showed me to the assay office. We'll find out tomorrow if it's worth claiming the place." It was a warm and sunny Wednesday morning when I walked into the office of the head assayer. Seth was an elderly man. Rumor had it that he was a professor back east. True, until he was caught spending an awful lot of time with one of his female students. Now he was doing stone assaying in the middle of nowhere. Such is the wages of sin. Anyway, he was an affable guy, liked to talk, like most of these over-educated guys. He said, "You have a rich vein, Jacob, but it is difficult to determine the exact amount of gold, for the rock in which it is embedded is pure silver." Did he just say silver? The entire surface of the rock was made of that material. Seth kept talking, ignoring my astonished reaction. He said, "That happens a lot in this area. God must have been very angry when he created our mountains, because everything here is fused together." I said, disbelieving, "Are you saying there is only silver and gold in these 2 samples?" Seth said, "Yes, it looks like you've hit the mother lode. If I were you, I would go to the state claims office as soon as possible." So that's the whole story of how Amy and I became unspeakably and somewhat undeservedly rich. We registered the site the same day and laid the land in the evening. Then I gave Pat 1/3 of the profits, if he would help me move the ore out. By then, he and Aphrodite had 2 children and needed the money. We hastily made arrangements with the men to look after a resting place and a store of supplies. Then we rode out of town on our trusty Conestoga and headed for the camp at Clear Creek. We had to disappear quickly. Seth was bound to blab, and people have been killed for more than that. The extraction was relatively simple. The vein ran right along the sides of the rift in the rock, so we didn't have to do much digging. I was in my early 20s, and I was as strong as I had ever been. Pat was a hard worker, and Aphrodite was stronger than him. Amy's main job was to scare away visitors. She did this with the help of her Henry. It was very difficult, but in the end we got a little over $20 million out of that suit. And in that respect, a couple of girls, a traveling Irishman, and a traveling sailor did quite well. After that, our lives could have gone down different roads. But Amy and I had our direction determined by what happened one beautiful evening the following April. We had lunch at Pell's Oyster House. I can hear you saying, "Oysters?" Denver is 1,000 miles from the sea. How could you eat oysters? Well, the new Transcontinental Railroad allowed suppliers to ship these tasty critters live in portable tank cars. And so oysters became a hot commodity in Denver. That's if you could afford them. And we could. Amy causes a stir every time she appears in public. She's just extraordinarily beautiful. But today she was especially stunning. She entered the restaurant in a silk dress that was one shade lighter than the deep purple color of her eyes. And while it was quite appropriate, it showed off every inch of her stunning figure. It was crowded. But one guy caught my eye right away. He was sitting with a group of 4 people at a table against the wall. Denver had become a pretty big trading center after the Colorado Central Railroad joined us with the Transcontinental Railroad in Cheyenne, and these guys obviously came to town to set up a little business. The stranger stared at Amy. Then he said something to the group, and everyone turned to look at her. All the other guys in the place were sneaking glances at my wife. So it wasn't strange that she was enjoying the undivided attention of a table full of men. It was just that this group was so frank. Then the man who had originally spotted Amy stepped back and walked toward us. He was clearly a salesman, dressed a little too flashily, in a plaid suit and derby hat. He had a wide, knowing grin on his fat face. We were seated in a small alcove in the back. I always make sure the maitre d' puts us in the best seat. In the light of the gas lamps, Amy was a model of serene beauty. She had her back to the approaching man, so I patted her arm and nodded behind her. She turned and looked at him curiously. He seemed absolutely thrilled to meet her. He said cheerfully, "Hello, little lady. I was wondering where you disappeared to after you left New Orleans. Tonight, I want to buy something of your special favor. That is, after you're done with this guy." We were both miles away from May, both in miles and in personal history, but Amy is truly an unforgettable woman. And this guy was clearly a former client. Amy threw me a panicked look. I nodded back. "Let me handle it." At that, the hurricane shutters slammed shut on my wife's eyes, and she took on that impenetrable expression I knew and hated so well. It killed me how quickly she could disappear behind the forbidding walls of her psyche. I stood up and said in a tone that made it clear I wanted this guy to leave, "You must be mistaken, my good man. This is my wife." He didn't understand at all what I had just said because he was looking at Amy avidly. He said, "I've had a lot of girls, but you're the best. Where do you work, honey?" Luckily, he was facing the alcove, so it was just me and Amy. I didn't want to make a fuss, so I grabbed his arm, untwisted him, and led him out the door. He protested every step of the way, but his complaints went unheeded. This guy didn't even realize the danger he was in. He saw a rich man, well-groomed and fashionably dressed. But we all have a past. It takes terrible strength and absolute ruthlessness to throw a 30-pound whale iron with enough force to kill a whale. Moreover, this primal ferocity lurks beneath my surface like a river of molten lava. The man's careless words brought everything to the surface. I dragged him into the alley, lifted him up, and slammed him against the wall. The thunderous impact knocked the spirit out of him. I still had him pinned against the wall when he finally managed to catch his breath. I said through clenched teeth, "You're going to lose your spirit right here in this alley if you don't go inside immediately and apologize for your mistake." In the flickering light of the gas lamps, he saw the image of death, and he shook with horror. He nodded weakly. He had already wet himself. I very carefully lowered him to the ground and wiped his back on his coat, which was soaked with paint. Then I gestured silently for him to return to our table. He walked up to Amy, who was looking at him with the hooded look in her eyes that I had seen so often during our trip west, and meekly said, "I apologize for my perplexity, madam. I see now that you are quite a different woman." Amy smiled kindly and said with hidden meaningfulness, "I understand. People often misunderstand me." Then he turned and strode away. I looked at my wife eloquently and said, "Why don't we go home, dear? I don't think we have anything more to do here." She rose gracefully, held out her hand and said, "Yes, I have had more than enough." On the way home, she asked me, "What did you do to him there?" We felt the whole building swaying. I gently replied, "I simply explained to him the disastrous consequences of poor vision, and he accepted the remark." Amy gave me one of her feline smiles and spent the rest of the evening thanking her knight in shining armor. This incident made the choice for us. We had to get as far away from Amy's past as possible. So we decided to reinvent ourselves in America's most populous city. So, unlike most people of our time, we traveled to the fabled island of Manhattan. We bought a mansion in Millionaire's Row, right next door to Pierpont Morgan's luxurious mansion. I struck up a friendship with JP while I was investing our gold and silver reserves. He was young then, not the old walrus you see in the pictures, and was just starting out. Therefore, he needed capital. Accordingly, our partnership was made in heaven. Of course, New York society didn't know what to think of us. We were young and fabulously rich from mysterious sources out west. Besides, I was clearly not a gentleman. Fortunately, Wild West stories were in vogue then, so they treated me like a cartoon cowboy, which was ironic because I was born 200 miles east of Manhattan. The community was just as puzzled by Amy. My wife was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman in New York City. Her style reflected her French, Creole, and plantation roots, and her natural sensuality drove men crazy. Women, especially the burly ones, didn't know what to do with her. But Amy was so seductively charming that she became a highly sought-after commodity among the better men. The problem was that we both hated snobs, and it killed any interest in belonging to society. I found parties tedious. Amy was just as annoyed, but life had taught her to mask her feelings, especially contempt. Mostly we just existed for each other, and that was enough for both of us. We had a staff that took care of the mansion, so we spent a lot of time traveling. The railroad system had developed to the point where unimaginable distances were commonplace. In 1860, it took almost 9 months to get from New Orleans to Denver. Now we could get from New York to Denver in a couple of days, comfortably ensconced in our personal railroad car. This convenience allowed us to visit places that were important to us. For example, on our 15th wedding anniversary, I took Amy on a hike to the remote cliff where we first knew each other. Still, it wasn't a great anniversary. For the 20th time, I took Amy with me to New Orleans. She was hesitant at first, given her associations with the place, but I told her she just had to see the rising young musical talent. She thought I was crazy, since she knew I didn't like music, but she agreed because she loved me. A guy was playing a horn and singing something called blues. In those days, it was considered African music, purely debauched, but this guy became famous as a magician using this new art form. He was only 23 years old, but he knew how to mesmerize an audience with his soulful sounds. That's why Amy and I were sitting in a rickety old auditorium in the French Quarter on the sultry night of July 21st, 1881. Up to this point, everything had been very humble. The only special thing was the magic of this guy's music. I could see that Amy was mesmerized by his absolute artistry. I had already bribed the owner. When he finished playing, the young virtuoso came over to us and sat down with us. He was bright and charming, very good-looking, and wearing the latest New Orleans style. He was clearly a ladies' man, and Amy was undoubtedly the most beautiful of the women present, even in her 40s. The man couldn't take his eyes off her. He began flirting outrageously, and of course, my sensual wife happily returned his attention. Money buys power. Accordingly, I managed to summon Alan Pinkerton himself to my little office in Madison Square. I told him that I had a job for his agency, and I was willing to pay an absurd amount of money to get what I needed. Pinkerton was Scottish. He loved money, so he shelled out the unheard of sum of $20,000 up front. It took a year, but finally, his agents came up with a name and a location. Now, it was time. Amy and the young man were sitting in the dim and smoky room, chatting animatedly, when I interrupted them abruptly. I said, "Louis is a very accomplished man, and he has quite a good story to tell." They both looked at me puzzled. Why had I brought it up? I added carelessly, "He taught himself to play the trumpet and came to New Orleans from Natchez in '74. He was only 15. He's probably only 23 now, but he's already a legend in New Orleans." They both looked at me in amazement, except that I looked like I had lost my mind. How did I know all this? I smugly said, "I'll let you two in on a little secret, but you have to promise me that there won't be any unseemly displays." They kept looking at me. Amy was puzzled. Louis was getting angry. He said, "What's this all about, man?" I leaned in conspiratorially and said, "I spent a lot of money to find this out, so please accept what I'm about to tell you as my gift to you both." I paused for effect. Then, with a melodramatic twinkle, I said, "Amy, I want you to meet your son, Louis." For a split second, Amy was speechless. Then she blacked out, turning colder than a mackerel. Louis only looked at me confused. I struggled to handle Amy's dead body as I said, "Give us a second." He nodded, still perplexed. Amy came to her senses almost immediately. I lifted her to her feet and led her outside. She was completely flustered as we stood under the gaslights. I had never seen her like that before. By way of explanation, I said, "The first thing I realized about you is that you are mourning the loss of your child. I love you. That's why I paid Mr. Pinkerton to find him for you." She looked like she was trying to believe me, but it was still so overwhelming. She looked at me triumphantly when I added, "Your boy was released after the war. He grew up under the care of one of the older women in the house. He considers her his mom, and we can leave here right now if you want him to continue to believe that." I sincerely said, "I just wanted you to see what a fine and accomplished young man he has become." I kissed her and gratefully said, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," and then added, "So you want to go back there? My wife is a warrior. She doesn't run away from anyone. So, of course she wanted to go back there." Amy's incredible violet eyes blazed as she spoke. "What you've done is the kindest thing imaginable. There was a hole in my heart. Now you've mended it. I will love you forever." Amy's son was still sitting at the table, looking completely dumbfounded. We sat down quietly, and I explained to him the circumstances of his birth without going into too much painful detail. He understood. Every former slave would have understood the story. I said sincerely, "I know you think of Elizabeth's mom as your mother, and she is, but my wife is your biological mother, and she mourns your loss every day of her life." I finished, "I just wanted her to see what a wonderful person you've become, and the success you've had." I added kindly, "Now I'm going to leave. I know you two have a lot to talk about." They were both openly crying as I walked out the door. So, I closed Amy's book of regrets, and the years flowed into the next century. A big part of the pleasure of growing old is sharing life's experiences with a special person. And no one was as dear to me as Amy. It's scary when you realize that you have less and less time left. That thought never crossed my mind when I had countless days ahead of me. And yet, one of the things about living with the right person is the joy that comes with each day. Like the weather in Louisiana, Amy was a woman of changeable moods. She could be sunny and silly, and then deep and sympathetic at the same hour. Whatever was necessary to ensure our happiness together. In that respect, I've never known a woman who could feel the moment so well. I don't know if Amy could sense my moods and adjust to them, or if we were just so alike. But in many ways, we were completely in sync. Of course, we had our differences. Intellectually, Amy was the strongest person I knew. To survive, she had to keep her nature behind adamantine walls. Now she had someone to love, and who loved her in return. She could finally be herself. My wife is of Cajun descent. She has a temper. I've used it, even as we've gotten older. But the ghosts of her past are too deep-seated to be completely exorcised. So there were times when they got the best of her. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she became enraged. And yet we never had one where we didn't know why another person acted or felt a certain way. Yourself? I don't regret anything. When I was pulling oars in a whaleboat, I never imagined I'd be as rich as I am now. I've lived a long life with a wonderful woman, and I've spent almost 70 adventurous years doing whatever I can think of. We built a mansion in Oyster Bay, near Teddy Roosevelt's Sagamore Hill. It was an unassuming place, 30 rooms, a dozen baths, and 80 acres of land. By then, Amy and I were used to the finer things in life. Louis lived with us when he played in New York. He was a charming and intelligent member of our family. Amy adored him. His half-siblings thought he was jazzy, whatever that meant. I knew that was the kind of music he played. But for some reason, I suffered by comparison. I was still a sailor at heart, so I wanted to spend the rest of my time by the sea. I had a 70-foot schooner moored at the foot of the house in Oyster Bay Harbor. Amy and I traveled up and down the East Coast, often making it as far as St. Augustine and even Miami. But I was the captain of that vessel, not a hand on it. But there was still one open account, and I knew I would not die a happy man if that debt was not paid. That's why the second part of the fortune I gave to Pinkerton was for the purpose of tracking down one Esau Briggs. Pinkerton is long dead, but his agency never went away. Eventually they found Briggs in Europe, and that's why he was so hard to find. Perhaps the varmint went abroad because he was afraid of me, but he stayed there because things were much more civilized there. For the last 50 years, Briggs has lived in London on his father's money. So the next day I went to the Cunard office in Manhattan and bought a ticket for 2 for the Mauretania. London in 1911 was a magnificent place. It was the capital of an empire where the sun never set, and the wealth that flooded into the city produced monumental buildings and magnificent mansions. We rented one in Berkeley Square. Neither Briggs nor I were young men, and I never would have had Amy if he hadn't seduced Faith. So maybe it sounds obsessive to chase a grudge for half a century, but it was time to draw a line under that account once and for all. I'd carried the emptiness of Faith's betrayal within me since the day I'd learned of it, and I should have known the reason why. Briggs was the son of the richest man in New Bedford. Now his situation had deteriorated considerably. By the first decade of the 20th century, electric lighting had replaced whale oil lamps, and Mr. Rockefeller's oil had become the most popular lubricant in the industry. Thus, the whaling industry had long since reached its peak. Briggs lived alone. He owned a small house just off Drury Lane, in Dryden Street, on the backside of Covent Garden. The Theatre Royal and the Opera House were close by, and the garden itself was always crowded, so he probably enjoyed the good life. But financially, his affairs were in a constant downward spiral. He took his coffee every morning in a little store on Maiden Lane, not far from the market. I watched him for a few days before I spoke to him. No, I wasn't going to kill him. Too much water had gone over the dam for that. Besides, I'd met and married the woman who was supposed to be by my side. But Faith's shadow still demanded satisfaction. I approached Briggs as he sat at a table near the entrance to the coffee shop. For privacy, he'd pulled it to a corner behind a faux marble column. It was shady and pleasant there. Briggs was reading yesterday's issue of the Daily Mail. I left Amy at our house. It was between me and my past. Amy was well aware of that. She had a few ghosts of her own. Briggs's shoulders slumped as he leaned back in his chair. Life seemed to be weighing on him. I remembered him as small and dapper, a real dandy. The man was obese, but he still wore clothes after the London fashion. It was shabby, as if it had been worn too many times. Perhaps it was his only outfit. I felt like I was back to the way I was when I picked up the paddle. Briggs never bullied me as a kid. That would have been crazy. I was much bigger and tougher than he was, but he always treated me with contemptuous superiority. He looked up, surprised and angry. How dare I intrude on his morning coffee? He saw a large and very rich gentleman, dressed in a tailored brown silk suit from Granville, and a vest, carrying an expensive cane. I was wearing a wide-brimmed fedora to hide my face. Lowering myself into the chair across from him, I said in a friendly tone, "Hello, Esau. Long time no see." My familiarity puzzled him. I obviously knew him, but he had no idea who I was. He said in an irritated voice, "I am drinking my morning coffee, my good man. Why do you bother me?" I took off my hat and leaned forward to look him straight in the eye. I said in a threatening tone, "I wanted to talk to you about Faith Polk. You remember her as Faith Ivarsson." Then I put my hat back on. I wanted to keep my face hidden. Briggs finally recognized me. His first expression was one of horror. It was as if his worst nightmare had popped up on a London street. I said in a friendly manner, "No, I'm not here to finish you off. Perhaps I should have, but I've lived a happy life. I just want to hear the story." Then I threw him a look that gave away my true feelings, and added quietly, "That better be true, or I might change my mind." He muttered, "How can I remember an incident that happened 50 years ago?" I said ominously, "I remember it every day of my life. Now it's time for you to rid me of those memories. What happened between you and Faith?" Old Esau Briggs was beginning to show himself. He couldn't help it. He was too narcissistic. He laughed and said, "It was easy." He paused to savor my distressed look, smirked, and added, "I always wanted to be around Faith, but she never paid attention to anyone but you. I was in Baltimore when I heard about the hurricane, and it got me thinking. I knew you wouldn't be back for a few years, even if your ship wasn't damaged. So I made up a story." He stopped, grinned, and with a wink said, "Your mother didn't believe me. Faith, on the other hand, did. It's like she expected something to happen to you. She told me she always knew she was going to lose you. She felt it every time you drifted away. She said she just loved you too much." It sent me into an agonizing fit of agony. Briggs was now bragging. He said, "Faith went into deep mourning. At first she wouldn't eat and slept all the time. It seemed as if she wanted to die too. I kept coming over and bringing her food and holding her while she cried. He was falling into a frenzy, as if reliving what had happened. I told her over and over again that she had to let you go, that you were dead. His smug smirk grew more and more nauseating as he added, "She kept asking me if I was sure. I swore on a stack of Bibles that it was true. I was a factor, and we knew these things. Your ship was one of the ones that was lost, and you disappeared." He looked at me cheerfully. One day she was crying, and I was holding her in my arms. She looked up, just for reassurance, I think, and I surprised her with a kiss. She resisted at first, but I knew all her held-back feelings had to go somewhere. Finally, she kissed me back. It was the first time. He stared at me, teasing. She was just as beautiful as I imagined. I knew Faith. She was like that. Briggs laughed and said, I had been enjoying time with her for a couple of months when she announced we were having a baby. She was beyond happy. Can the pain get worse? Briggs finished his coffee and said dismissively, Of course it didn't happen. She was fun to be with for a while, but the high of conquest was gone. I left on the next ship for France. Then he added mockingly, I heard she died giving birth to a baby. He chuckled and said, Well, that's right. Women are just women. I watched Briggs's smug face as he recounted my wife's humiliation. He savored my expression of pain and sadness. It was the last thing he saw. The jury returned. The verdict was in. Sword canes were popular in London before the advent of Bobby Peel's Metropolitan Police. It was the only method of self-defense for a gentleman that did not require openly carrying a blade. Therefore, there were still many good canes available for sale. Mine was a beautiful lacquered specimen, black, with a large, shiny brass handle. Hidden inside, firmly attached to the handle, was an ultra-thin, 2-foot-long, razor-sharp, hardened steel rapier. I pulled it out discreetly, listening to Briggs brag about ruining my wife. It took him a moment to realize what was about to happen. His eyes filled with panic. I hissed with 52 years of hatred, This is for Faith! Then I used my terrible strength to bring the blade out from under the coffee table and be done with it. It was silent and clean. The horror in his gaze vanished almost instantly, replaced by nothingness. With my right hand, I shoved the sword back into the wooden case of the cane. Briggs deserved far worse, but that was all the justice I could do under the circumstances. I prayed that hell existed. Then I made it a point to say a final goodbye to Briggs, just in case anyone was watching. Eventually, people would realize he was without a soul. But by then, I'd be a ghost. The business with my past was done, and the account was finally closed. I had mixed feelings about returning to our home. The debt was cancelled, and I could spend the rest of my days with my perfect friend. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what my life would have been like if Esau Briggs had never been born. Amy waited with the wary look she had honed in her former profession. I said simply, He's done. She asked the practical question, Any witnesses? I shrugged and said, Maybe, but they only saw Briggs talking to a sports guy in a fedora, not a financial tycoon like me. He left us too quickly to make a fuss. She asked, No regrets? I said, Only that I won't live forever, because I have the most wonderful woman in the world to spend my whole life with. I have no qualms about getting rid of this creep. She asked, What's next? I replied, Let's do a grand tour. London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Rome. I want to stay in Europe until next spring. My sly wife had that familiar look in her eyes. She knew I needed to be reassured. It was early morning, but Amy came over, took my hand, and led me toward our bedroom. She wanted to convey to me the essence of our eternal partnership. Her performance lasted several hours. When we finished our feast, she asked, puzzled, Why are we waiting for spring? I excitedly replied, I've seen many changes at sea, from wooden sailing brigs to steel passenger liners, but I have never seen anything like the ship I booked us on. I continued enthusiastically, This will be her maiden voyage, and she is said to be the fastest and most luxurious liner in the North Atlantic trade. Plus, it features all the new advances in ship design. Why, Titanic is even unsinkable. Epilogue. There was complete pandemonium on the boat deck. They were venting steam from valves high up on the funnels, and the thundering rumble added to the confusion. The time was just over 1 o'clock in the morning, and people were crowding around, mostly just confused, when Second Officer Lightoller started loading the lifeboats. I could see the fear and despair on his face. I thought, this is real. The night was cold and crystal clear. There was a great number of stars in the sky. I had seen many skies during my time at sea, but this diamond-studded velvet canopy was magnificent. I put my arms around Amy and pulled her to me. She was wearing one of her full-length mink coats to protect herself from the cold. I was wearing a heavy tweed all-weather coat and a hat with a flat brim. Amy's maid Ellen was with us, and her friend Betsy, who was Lady Allison's maid. They shared a second-class cabin. We approached Lifeboat Hash 8, which was our station. Captain Smith never conducted a formal lifeboat drill. There were too many honorable men aboard to attempt it. But the number of the lifeboat that was assigned to our cabin was written on a small plaque next to the rosewood door of our room. I heard Lightcaller shout, "Women and children only," as he and the crew boarded the people huddled around the boat. We went up with Betsy and Ellen. There were already about 20 women and several crew members in the lifeboat. Lightoller gallantly assisted Amy as she stepped gracefully over the side. Then Ellen stepped forward. Lightoller blocked her way. He said, "I'm sorry, miss, but we only have room for one." He turned to me and said politely, "You're next, sir." Ellen's eyes reflected panic. I knew what Lightoller was talking about. We were obviously first-class passengers, and Ellen was just a maid. I'm not a social warrior, but I couldn't accept the fact that I would keep my ancient skin and this young woman would go down with the ship. So I said, "I will not come aboard while women and children are still on the ship." And I gestured for Ellen to take my place. She looked at me puzzled. I said roughly, "Go to the ship, girl. I'm not going." With those words, Ellen stepped over the side and into the lifeboat. Amy watched the exchange from one of the benches in the lifeboat. Amy stood up as soon as Ellen came aboard. Lightcaller said irritably, "Please be seated, ma'am. We're about to cast off." Amy took off her coat and carefully held it out to Ellen. She said affectionately, "Take it, dear. You'll need it to keep you warm. I don't need it now." Then she gave Lightoller a menacing look and declared, "I will not part with my husband. As we have lived, so shall we die together." And to my utter amazement, the wife got out of the boat. I said anxiously, "You must get back to the boat, my love. No one can survive in this chilly water." There are moments when Amy's strange violet eyes seem to glow with a deep fire that feeds her soul. She touched my cheek and said affectionately, "Don't argue with me, Jacob. You know you'll never win." Then my wife turned and pushed Betsy, the second maid, into Lightoller's arms. She said in a voice that tolerated no objection, "This woman will take my place." I looked at Amy with a mixture of surprise and horror. She cast one of her patented, alluring glances at me, took my hand, and said affectionately, "Where you go, I go." With those words, we walked over to a pair of chaise lounges and sat down. We both realized that we were going to die soon. Everyone dies someday anyway, and today was as good a day as any. At least we would leave together. It would be the perfect ending to a lifetime of love. We talked about the early days as the deck continued to tilt. Finally, I took both of her hands in mine and said fervently, "Forever!" She gave me a loving smile and simply replied, "Yes." Her violet eyes engulfed me as the dive began. And so, our story draws to a close. A tale of love, loss, and redemption, woven through the tapestry of American history. From the untamed wilderness to the glittering metropolis, our protagonists have faced challenges that would have broken lesser souls. We've witnessed the power of human connection, the resilience of the spirit, and the enduring nature of love. As we bid farewell to these unforgettable characters, we're left with a sense of profound satisfaction and a touch of melancholy. This epic journey has been a privilege to share with you. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary adventure. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories. And if you crave even deeper dives into this world, check out the full story on our Patreon page. Until next time, keep exploring, keep dreaming, and remember, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the echoes of those tales can last a lifetime.